Right off the bat, biggest spoiler warning possible. There is tons of evidence for this idea throughout Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, and the big reveal arguably does occur in Onyx Storm, but it seems like the vast majority of people missed it, and if I'm right, I'm sure this would end up being one of the biggest plot points in the next book of the Empyrean series. So if you'd rather discover it there, click away now. Real quick preface. If you found the last chapter and a half or so of Onyx Storm to be confusing, for example, if you didn't reread the conversation between Xaden and Sigale at the end of his POV chapter enough times to parse out the meaning behind their whole cryptic exchange, then a decent amount of what I'll have to say here might strike you as similarly confusing, and I'd recommend going to watch this other video I made explaining the end of Onyx Storm before you move on to this one. Otherwise, let's get started. As you'll know if you watched that other video or did enough of your own analysis, during the 12 hours of Violet's memory that Imogen wiped, Xaden was executing a very complex plan, which obviously included marrying Vi so that she could take over rule as Duchess of Tyrrendor, but I'm convinced that was only one small part of it. There's also the matter of the 6 missing dragon eggs and the, quote, 4 riders, their dragons, and 3 elders murdered in the valley that we need to consider too. When I read through it the first time, I assumed that those things were unrelated to our main characters and that some other Venin or Umbriel was responsible or something, unwilling to imagine that Xaden had become so evil that he had murdered half of the dragon elders and stolen a bunch of eggs. But on rereading a few things, it seems pretty clear that this was part of Xaden's plan too. Granted, that would make him a decent amount more evil than I thought we'd see, but I also think the big twist I'm about to get into will prove that betraying dragonkind isn't quite as evil as it might seem on the surface. Throughout all 3 books, there have been suggestions that dragons aren't exactly the good guys. Even in the very first chapter of Fourth Wing, we learn that the Fables of the Baron is, quote, a collection of stories that warn us against the lure of magic and even demonize dragons. It also turned out that the first 6 and their dragons purposefully crafted the Wardstone with a rune to explicitly exclude dragons from the Ward's protection, segregating them and forsaking them to fight the Venin alone, which in hindsight seems pretty fucked up to say the least. There's another clincher of an example that I'll come to in a bit, but I dismissed it and every other instance suggesting that dragons aren't good the first time I read them, until the big twist in Onyx Storm. So let's explore that first. In Xaden's Onyx Storm POV chapter, this happens. "Did you not ask for power?" Berwyn snarls, holding 2 alloy-hilted daggers of his own as he approaches Panchek. "Have I not provided?" "Put those away. We both know you're not going to hurt me." Panchek reaches for the net over his dragon. "I'm the only one who can give you access to your son." "I have another." Real quick, I'm guessing that first son is a reference to Jack Barlow, and "I have another" refers to Xaden in the parlance of initiates or ASIMs under the same sage or maven being brothers, but that's not the important part. Berwyn stabs deep between the dragon's scales, and it desiccates, green draining from its scales and shrinking in on itself to a husk. Terror bursts through the ice. Berwyn just killed a dragon with a dagger. How the fuck is that possible? My theory is that it's possible because dragons are dark wielders. Think about it. Setting aside species for a moment, what is a dark wielder? Someone who channels power directly from the source, exactly what dragons do. Sure, humans are known to be especially easily corrupted by power, which might be why, when a human does it, they become Venin and are automatically considered evil. Though, I think there'll turn out to be a decent amount of nuance to that, as exemplified by Xaden still fighting against the truly evil Venin throughout Onyx Storm. There's no reason to think that it doesn't work the exact same way with dragons, except perhaps they're somewhat more resistant to being corrupted by all that power quite so quickly. There's plenty more evidence to back this up as well. I think even Taryn himself alluded to this in Chapter 3 of Iron Flame when he said, "The first 6 were desperate to save their people when they approached the dens over 600 years ago. Those dragons formed the first Empyrean and bonded humans only to protect their hatching grounds from Venin, who were the bigger threat. We don't exactly have opposable thumbs for weaving wards or runes. Neither species has ever been entirely truthful, both using the other for their own reasons and nothing more." That sounds to me like before the Great War, dragons and humans were not on friendly terms at all. It would make sense if before dragons started bonding with riders, humans saw them as the epitome of monsters, huge fire-breathing beasts that channeled weaponized magic directly from the earth, hence why they were demonized in fables. Perhaps they even terrorized humans and might have been what drove some of the first Venom to channel magic for themselves in order to stand a fighting chance. Which brings me back to that other example I skipped over a minute ago. I never took it seriously because it's what we're told by Venom, and I just blindly assumed that they were pure evil and couldn't be trusted. But once Panchek's dragon desiccated from being stabbed with an alloy-hilted dagger, and it occurred to me that dragons might be dark wielders too, suddenly that made me wonder, if my assumptions about dragons were wrong, maybe some of my assumptions about Venom were wrong too. This series is full of such masterful storytelling that it would make sense if it's not as two-dimensional as just dragons good, Venom evil, but there are complexities and nuances to it. Maybe certain things I dismissed just because they were said by Venom weren't so unreliable. What if Jack truly does have reason to believe it when he tells Violet, "Power should be accessible to everyone strong enough to wield it, not just who they see fit. You conveniently see me as the villain, but you're bonded to two." So my guess is that once humans started channeling magic for themselves and becoming Venom 600 years ago, they were more easily corrupted by all that power and became a threat to both dragons and other humans. So the two species formed a wary alliance to defeat the Venom, or at least enough of them that the rest were driven into hiding for the most part. But since new, or old, Venom would always be a threat from beyond the wards, the alliance had to remain intact, and over the centuries it became a new normalized status quo. Subsequent generations either forgot or were prevented from learning what things had been like before, and eventually things arrived at the situation that we're introduced to in Fourth Wing. I think this is also backed up by a lot of what we learn from the Irids in Onyx Storm. Based on what Leothin tells Andarna in Chapter 53 right before he leaves with her, rather than channeling magic from the earth like other dragons, the Irids simply are magic. I'm guessing that's why they have no trouble surviving beyond the continent, unlike all of the other dragons who struggled during the Quest Squad adventures, and why the isles closer to wherever they're hiding out have more magic, because they're a source of magic. My interpretation is that being inherently magical, the Irids tend to kind of naturally vibe with the whole nature likes all things in balance moral and only use their magic for peaceful purposes. They seem to have disdain for anyone, Venom or Dragon, that channels magic from the earth, especially if they use it for violence. I'm guessing that once humans started channeling and the Great War broke out, the Irids simply wanted no part of it. I suppose one of them must have hung around at least long enough to fire the Ward Stone, but then the rest of them just noped straight out of there. I think that because when Andarna tells the Irids her story and asks if she passed their test, they reveal that Violet was the one being tested and that she failed. They tell Andarna, "You were left behind as the criterion, the measure of their growth, their ability to choose tranquility and harmony with all living things. We'd hoped that you would return to tell us that the humans had evolved, that they had blossomed under the Ward Stones and no longer used magic as a weapon. But instead, you have showed us the opposite. And Dragonkind has not learned their lesson either." If you reread all of Chapter 41 through this lens, everything in it suddenly makes so much more sense. So basically, my theory is that most dragons are much worse than we've been led to believe, at least from the point of view of the truly good entity in this world, i.e., the Irids. I do suspect that the Irids' perspective will prove to be overly idealistic, and other dragons can still be good despite channeling from the source and being more realistic about violence sometimes being necessary. And similarly, being Venom doesn't automatically make someone evil. Yeah, they're in danger of power corrupting them, but obviously some of them have good reasons for turning. Zayden is an example of one who, despite planning to do a lot of very shady shit, is still fighting against the truly evil ones. But I think we'll come to learn that a lot of non-Irid dragons are straight up antagonists, if not outright villains. Which brings me nicely back to what I think Zayden's master plan from the end of Onyx Storm is. I'm convinced that I know what happened during the 12 hours missing from Violet's memory. So, one last spoiler warning here. If you'd rather find out those specifics when reading the next book, click away now. I think that Zayden saw that dragon desiccate when stabbed by the alloy dagger, and he recognized that dragons are dark wielders. He realized that they're no better than he is, quickly formulated his whole plan, and then went full on final boss dark mode. After doing so, he asks Egale if she'll forsake him, meaning sever the bond, but he now has that ace up his sleeve. When she asks what's left of him to forsake, he says, "You tell me," and lowers his mental shields, reconnecting their minds so that she'll know what he's planning. Then, her next breath is laced with sulfur and her eyes widen. You cannot mean to. You saw what happened. It is the only way. I think Xaden realized there was no way they'd ever win the war without the army from Umbriel, the Isle of Dune, and now that he knows that dragons are dark wielders, their price, dragon eggs, is no longer a deal breaker for him. Sigale recognizes that he's right, that, quote, it is the only way, and still respects his ruthlessness and that he's willing to do anything that is necessary to accomplish his goal. And since she has the same goal, she commits herself to trying to execute the entirety of Xaden's master plan, deciding that she's going to be in this with him until the bitter end. Persuade Tern, I beg. Everything depends on it. We will ask, Sigale finally says, flexing her claws in the rocky soil. And her decision will determine our fate. Those are terms I can agree to. We're airborne in less than a minute. And then in the final chapter, we learn official numbers are 4 riders, their dragons, and 3 elders murdered in the valley in what we're estimating is the last few hours. And so far, the tally is at 6 missing eggs from the hatching grounds, but they're double checking. My theory is that in addition to marrying Violet, during those 12 hours, he also went to the hatching grounds. I'm guessing he tried to negotiate with the Empyrean, which is why he only took 6 eggs instead of the full dozen Umbriel had asked for. But half of the elders still refused, which is why he killed 3 of them, as well as 4 other dragons and their riders. This could also explain why Violet asked Imogen to erase her memory. Whether she was aware of the outcome or not, I bet she was at least aware of what the plan was, and either needed the deniability and or simply wasn't going to be able to live with it. Okay, obviously that got pretty fucking dark, so to try and end this on a more positive note, I actually think this big twist about dragons being dark wielders is a surprisingly hopeful development for the greater arc of the series and the overarching moral of the story. You may have seen the video I made back in the day theorizing about what Violet's second signet was going to turn out to be. If not, basically the idea was that just like she wields pure power from Tern, who channels weaponized magic from the earth, she was going to wield pure power from Andarna, who would channel benevolent magic from the sky. Obviously, that didn't turn out to be her second signet specifically, but I still think some version of that core idea will come to fruition. The fact that the Irids hoped, quote, humans would evolve, blossom under the Wardstone, and no longer use magic as a weapon, that bodes well. They saw a, quote, capacity for growth that humans and dragons had the ability to choose tranquility and harmony with all living things. Sure, that's probably too idealistic, and shit's going to get much worse before it gets better, thanks to Xaden being a broody shadow boy that's all about darkness, with just that thread of Violet's light and love that he clings to, driving him at his core. But on the other hand, Violet is warmth and light and air and love, with just that little kernel of violence that Xaden recognizes in her. Together, they'll represent that proverb that we get from Andarna in Fourth Wing, that nature likes all things in balance. I do think there will be a brilliant Rebecca Yarros-style twist on that trope, but I don't want to get into any more specifics at this point. I'll put all of my specific predictions about the endgame of the series into a separate video that I won't make public until after the 4th book comes out, but eventually it'll be linked right here, so make sure to subscribe and click the bell if you want to be notified when that comes out. For now, if you're looking for some more Empyrean content to help cure your Onyx Storm book hangover, I'd suggest checking out my fanfiction, which retells the events of Fourth Wing from Xaden's point of view, including revelations from the following 2 books like Xaden and Garrick's second signets. Thanks for watching.